Today we're going to be talking about language and culture. This is chapter 3, section 2. I would recommend that as we are going through the information today that you take notes so you'll have that information for the check for understanding as well as your test at the end of this chapter. So we spent our last lesson talking about culture, and remember that culture is basically things that you have in common with a group of people, like symbols that represent your culture, ideals, so values that you hold with them as well. And so today we're really going to be focusing on the language aspect, because oftentimes cultures or people within a culture share the same language. So before we can really launch into the discussion about languages, we need to talk about symbols. Symbols are a thing that stands for or represents something else. And so here you can see in the image, this in the very center, it says United States or the USA, and around it you can see some very common symbols or themes that we all know very well here in the United States. So you can see the flag, the Statue of Liberty, you can see baseball, a hamburger, tennis shoes, things like that, turkey. So things that are very common within our culture. But we know this, there aren't really any words on here, but we know that these things represent the United States, even if it did not say USA, because all these things are a representation of parts of our culture. So symbols can represent different things in different cultures. So if you go back to the image before, these might bring up some sense of nostalgia and pride in people who are from the United States. But if you were here from another country and you saw this, you might not have that same connection to these images and may not invoke that same feeling in you, in them that it does in you. So another example of clapping in the United States is usually a good thing, right? If somebody is performing and then people start clapping, that is usually kind of a rally for some more, of whatever they've been doing or performing. In Latin America, however, clapping is the opposite. You do not want people to clap for you, because clapping is actually kind of like booing in the United States. So clapping, even though it's an action and it's not just an image, clapping itself is considered a symbol. It's how we interpret this motion and this sound that is coming from your hands. So how are language and culture related? So language is a combination of symbols, sounds that have meaning, and all of our letters are really just symbols if you think about it. And they have very little meaning until people put meaning to them. So these are just all different shapes, but we associate sounds with those shapes, like A and A, B and B, C and S. So these sounds, when combined, they have meaning, because that is how we create our language. Humans use language to pass their experiences, ideas, and knowledge on to others. If you do not understand the language, it is difficult to have experiences, ideas, and knowledge passed to you. So language is very, very important in any culture so that it can continue to thrive by passing down that information. So the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, or also called the hypothesis of linguistic relativity, says that language is our guide to reality. We use certain words to describe experiences. Every language uses different words, causing our perceptions to be different. And so the example here is the word snow. For us in the United States, especially those of us living in the South, snow is frozen water that falls from the sky that's fluffier than ice. So it's not quite sleet, it's not rain, it's just this fluffy frozen water that falls from the sky. And we don't really use very many other words to describe it besides just snow. So you look outside and you see it falling down, you're like, it's snowing. But if you live in a culture where snow is a huge part of your life, you may start noticing variations in types of snow. So you might notice like a heavier or a wet snow or a drier snow, and things like that. So if we compare our version of snow, snow is just snow. But if you look at the Inuit people, who used to be called Eskimos, that's not really the proper term for it, but we refer to these are Native Americans who live particularly up towards Alaska and towards that Arctic Circle. Their language has over 20 words for snow. So they have 20 words for snow. And so, you know, that is obviously a variation in culture. They have a different lifestyle than we do. And, you know, if you think about like colors, for example, like if you're trying to color with a crayon and you look at that crayon, you might say, oh, it's blue. But then you can start thinking about other words that describe blue. Okay, so that's another example that we have different words to describe this color. And if you were to go to a different culture, they might have a different word to describe that color. Okay, so what happens though if you have two areas with the same language? How can they end up with different cultures even though they share the same language? Well, very simply, if you think about how Great Britain colonized North America, they came over and they brought their language with them. And the people who colonized North America, you know, were kind of left to fend for themselves. Yes, there was still British intervention, but there was a culture developed separate from England. But we do still have some things in common. So, for example, many of you probably like sweet tea. Well, drinking tea is very common in Great Britain. They just drink it differently. They like hot tea. And here in Alabama especially, we oftentimes drink cold tea. And so it's just a variation in culture, and there, you know, we have a different history than Great Britain because we have separated from them, even though our language is still the same. Learning a new language can alter a person's perception of the world. So once you start getting into foreign languages, you can kind of start having a better understanding and better appreciation of other people who come from other parts of the world, because you learn those words, but then you also learn about how those words make people feel within that culture. So most people confine themselves to the language and vocabulary they learned from birth because that's usually the simplest thing. We are best able to learn a new language the younger we are when we are exposed to it. And so many of you probably learned English, you know, starting from a very, very young age. If your parents' dominant language is English, then at home, even in infancy, you've been learning those English words, and it wasn't something that you necessarily had to sit down and study. You just learned it over time, and it became part of your identity and part of how you relate to other people. It is challenging to learn a new language, but it also can be very enlightening to learn a new language so that you can better understand a culture. Other factors that shape perception: differences in culture also shape perception of the world. So Germans kind of have this closed door policy. They oftentimes will keep doors closed within businesses and things like that. The Japanese are very well known for having these paper walls as part of their culture, very kind of simplistic architecture and decor. So that really has very little to do with their language, but just to do with their environment and their history within that culture.